My name is Courtney Allen. I was 32 years old at dinner at my parents' house in Columbus, Ohio, when my mom casually said to give my brother the keys to my apartment. Her tone was light, as if she were talking about leftovers, not the only place I could call home. Jason is moving in tonight, she added, pushing a pan of lasagna toward my dad, while my brother scrolled through his phone as if it were all over. My stomach dropped so fast I had to hold on to the back of my chair. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching and what time it is, because I really want to know if this is as crazy to you as it felt to me. For as long as I can remember, my mom has been telling people that I'm the easy one and Jason is the needier one. He was the older one, the golden boy, the one who tolerated mistakes and got applause for barely trying, while I learned early on that quiet competence would get the job done, but never get noticed. That evening, the mashed potatoes cooled on the plate, and my mother waved and said, "Honey, you're not in the apartment much anyway, and Jason can't stay in the motel forever." My father interjected, saying, "Keep it in the family," as if my house were the spare living room we all owned. Jason didn't even look up, just smirked and said, "Thanks for being calm, Court," as if I had already agreed. I wasn't chill, I was stunned. I asked how they even had keys, since I'd never given Jason a set, and my mom shrugged like I was nitpicking, saying she'd grabbed the spare from the hook in my old bedroom when I was over last month. She acted like taking that key without asking was normal, something any reasonable mother would do if her son needed stability. My dad reminded me that they had helped me when I was younger, a phrase that always meant we did something for Jason and skimmed from you. Sitting there at their dining table, same floral placemats we'd had since middle school, I could feel that familiar script tightening around my throat. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin dinner. Don't be ungrateful. I stayed just long enough to rinse dishes and fake a smile before I grabbed my coat and left. Driving back toward downtown Columbus, past the campus lights and old brick buildings, I kept replaying a quieter version of this same story from years earlier. When I was 16, I worked weekends at a grocery store, saving every tip in a shoebox under my bed, dreaming about buying a cheap used car one day. Jason, already in community college and already behind on everything, overdrafted his account and came home in tears. By the end of the week, my shoebox was empty, and my mom was telling me it was all for the family, that Jason needed the money more than some high school car. Nobody asked me. They just told me to be proud I could help. That was the first time I learned that my effort was negotiable currency, and his mistakes were gracefully covered. College didn't change much. I juggled a full course load at Ohio State and a campus dining hall job, then an internship downtown just to cover my part of tuition and rent. Jason switched majors 3 times, dropped classes mid-semester, and somehow there was always a solution: a new loan. My dad co-signed a family member investing in his future. A semester off spun as a bold reset. When the landlord once called about our late rent, I learned my parents had quietly redirected part of the money I'd sent home to help Jason catch up on his car payments. My mom told me not to be dramatic and reminded me that siblings share. Eventually, I stopped expecting anyone to ask what I needed, and I built a life around never counting on them. That's why after graduation, I worked extra hours at my marketing job, skipped vacations, and lived with roommates way longer than I wanted, funneling every spare dollar toward a down payment on a small one-bedroom condo near the short north. Signing the papers for that place felt like putting my name on proof that I could support myself without borrowing from anyone. It cost around $200,000, which might not be much in some cities, but to me, it was 8 years of sacrifices, side gigs, and saying no when friends splurged on trips. My parents congratulated me, but I saw that flash in their eyes, like my independence offended the story they liked to tell about our family. Jason showed up once, said it was cute, and joked that maybe he'd crash there if things got rough. Things did get rough for him, not me. Jason lost his job at a car dealership after showing up late too many times, then bounced between roommates until he wore out his welcome. My parents put him in a cheap extended stay motel on Hamilton Road, complaining nonstop about the cost while still calling him our poor boy. I offered leads on jobs, helped him rewrite his resume, and tried to keep some emotional distance. So, sitting at their dining table, hearing my mom talk about my condo like it was a spare storage unit for Jason's chaos, I wasn't shocked that they'd sacrifice me again. I was just stunned at how bold they'd gotten. By the time I parked in my usual spot near my building that night, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I walked up to the entrance, punched in the building code, and climbed the stairs to my floor, hoping maybe they'd exaggerated. Maybe Jason hadn't actually moved in yet. When I turned the corner, my hope died. There were cardboard boxes stacked outside my door labeled with Jason's handwriting, plus a dented duffel bag leaning against the wall. Someone had taped a crooked printout on the door that said Jason's Place with a smiley face. My chest tightened as I slid my key into the lock and twisted. It stopped halfway. I tried again harder. Nothing. My key no longer worked. From inside, I heard the muffled sound of a TV and Jason laughing at something perfectly at home. I stared at the lock, every sensible part of me arguing with itself. Maybe he had accidentally jammed it. Maybe the building had changed something. Maybe I was misunderstanding. I knocked, and Jason opened the door wearing one of my old college hoodies, holding a beer I definitely hadn't bought. Behind him, I saw my couch pushed against a different wall, my framed prints tossed in a corner, suitcases half unpacked on my rug. "Oh, hey, you made it," he said like I was the guest. When I told him to hand over my keys and get his stuff out, he shrugged and said, "Mom and Dad said it's cool. You're barely here anyway. Relax." The dismissal in his voice hit harder than the lock changed without my consent. I stepped back into the hallway and called my parents, pacing between the elevator and the fire extinguisher. My mom answered on the first ring, all sugar again, asking if I'd made it home safe. I told her Jason had changed my lock and was refusing to leave, and she responded like I was scolding a toddler for a spilled cup. "He only had the locksmith adjust it so he'd feel secure," she said. "You have that nice job. You can stay with a friend for a while. Don't be selfish, Courtney. He has nowhere else to go." My dad got on the line to remind me that they had co-signed a small student loan years ago, as if that meant they now controlled my property. When I quietly repeated that this condo was legally mine alone and I hadn't given permission, my mom sighed like I was breaking her heart. Hearing her call me selfish was like tripping an old bruise I'd learned to walk around. All those times, my things disappeared for Jason every time my plans got overridden, because my parents wanted to protect his feelings crashed together in that fluorescent hallway. I told them calmly that Jason needed to leave tonight, and my mom's voice snapped hard, warning me not to do anything stupid and not to drag outsiders into family business. I stared at my useless key in my palm and realized that family business had always meant we get to do what we want, and you swallow it. My hands were still trembling when I hung up, opened my phone again, and this time dialed three numbers I'd never imagined calling on my own brother, 911. The dispatcher asked for my address, whether anyone was in immediate danger, and I heard myself explaining in a strange, detached tone. I said that I was the sole owner of the condo, that my brother had moved in without my consent, changed the locks, and refused to leave. Saying the words out loud made everything feel more real, like I'd stepped off the script my parents wrote for me. Within 20 minutes, I saw the swirl of red and blue lights through the stairwell window. A female officer with her dark hair pulled back a badge, catching the hallway. Light walked up and introduced herself as Officer Iris Gomez, her voice steady enough that I felt my breathing slow for the first time that night. Officer Gomez asked to see my ID, then the closing papers I'd shoved into a folder when I left that morning. I handed her the deed, the mortgage statement, everything with my name printed in black ink and no one else's. She nodded slowly, clearly, and asked if anyone besides building management had ever had permission to live there. I told her no, that my brother had a motel room, not a lease, and that I had never offered him this space. "So he's not on the title, not on a lease. And he changed your locks without consent," she repeated, almost like she wanted me to hear it from someone who wasn't related to me. Then she knocked on my door, identified herself as police, and asked Jason to step out. When Jason opened the door and saw the uniform, he laughed nervously, saying this was all a misunderstanding, that his parents said it was fine. Officer Gomez kept her tone, even asking him whether he had any paperwork showing he had rights to stay there. He gestured vaguely toward the hallway and said, "It's my sister's place. We're family," like that was a magic phrase. She looked back at me and asked in front of him if I wanted him removed and if I was willing to press charges for criminal trespass and property damage if necessary. My throat felt tight, but I said yes. Jason's face went slack, like the idea that I might actually say those words had never crossed his mind. When he refused to leave, insisting he needed more time, Iris called for another unit. The second officer arrived. They stepped inside, and I stood in the hall, listening to Jason argue that he'd done nothing wrong, that my parents had told him he could stay as long as it takes. Iris came back out and quietly told me they'd found my front door hardware in the trash, and a fresh receipt for a new lock with Jason's name on it, which strengthened the case. She explained that because I'd clearly revoked any permission and he still refused to leave, they were placing him under arrest for criminal trespass and vandalism, and documenting the lock replacement as evidence. Watching my brother get led down the hallway in handcuffs felt surreal. I hated seeing him like that, but I also hated that everyone had assumed I would never let it get this far. After they took him away, Iris walked through the unit with me briefly, just enough to confirm there was visible damage and that none of my essential belongings had been stolen outright, though she recommended I stay somewhere else until they could finish documenting everything. My living room looked like he'd been there for weeks instead of days. Pizza boxes on my coffee table, my throw blanket balled up on the floor, a cigarette burn on the edge of my balcony doorframe, even though I'd always been strict about no smoking inside. Iris photographed everything, then locked the new temporary knob the building maintenance guy installed and handed me a fresh key. "This is still your home," she said quietly. "And what happened here is a crime. Standing up for that doesn't make you cruel." I checked into a cheap hotel near the interstate that night with a duffel bag of clothes and my work laptop, feeling like I'd been evicted from my own life. The next morning, my phone lit up with messages from relatives whose numbers I didn't even recognize anymore. They weren't asking where I'd slept or whether I was okay. They were demanding to know why I'd had Jason dragged off in handcuffs, accusing me of overreacting and ruining your poor parents. My mom left 3 voicemails in a row, sobbing about how embarrassed she was, begging me to fix this and tell the police it was a misunderstanding. My dad's text said only, "We never thought you'd betray your own brother like this." None of them mentioned the lock, the damage, or the fact that Jason had effectively pushed me out of my own home. In the days that followed, guilt rolled in waves. I went to work, tried to focus on marketing reports and campaign timelines, but I found myself staring at spreadsheets, hearing my mom's tearful voice instead of my coworkers. At night, lying on the stiff hotel mattress, I questioned whether I had gone too far, whether I should have just let Jason stay a few months. But every time that thought surfaced, I pictured my key sticking in a lock I hadn't agreed to change and the sign on my own door claiming the place as his. A few days later, Officer Gomez called to say that the county prosecutor was filing charges and that I'd need to provide repair estimates for restitution. She asked if I still wanted to go forward. My voice shook, but I said yes. When the crime scene unit finished with the photos, Iris met me back at the condo so I could really see what Jason had done. It was worse than that first quick walkthrough. My bedroom door had a fist-sized hole near the handle, probably where he'd gotten frustrated. There was a stain on the carpet that smelled like spilled beer, and something else I didn't want to identify. The bathroom counter was covered in sticky rings from energy drinks, and my neatly folded towels had been tossed into a damp pile in the tub. In the kitchen, my set of nice dishes, the one thing I'd splurged on, had 3 plates chipped, like he'd slammed them into the sink. "He was only here a few days," I whispered more to myself than to Iris. "He didn't earn this space," she said, scanning the room with professional distance but personal understanding. People tend to be careless with what they're handed and careful with what they've had to fight for. Her words landed in my chest like something I'd been trying to explain my whole life. I sent the photos and repair estimates, which came out to almost $15,000 between the lock, the door, the carpet cleaning, and replacing damaged items. The prosecutor added those figures to the restitution request. Walking out of my condo after that keys jingling in my hand, I felt both shaken and strangely clearer. This wasn't about a messy couch. It was about the way my parents had trained Jason to believe my boundaries were optional. The court process took months. Jason's public defender reached out with a plea deal, and I was told that if I wanted any say, I needed to appear at the hearing. The idea of sitting in the same room as my parents after everything made my stomach twist. But I also knew that staying home would mean letting other people narrate what he'd done. So on a gray Tuesday morning, I walked into the Franklin County Courthouse, my hands cold, even though the building was overheated, and checked in outside the courtroom where Judge Patrick Sloan would be hearing the case. My parents sat on a bench across the hall, my mom's eyes red, my dad's jaw clenched. Jason sat between them in a borrowed dress shirt, staring at the floor. When the clerk called the case number, we filed inside, and I took a seat in the second row close enough to hear everything, but far enough that I didn't have to smell my dad's aftershave. Judge Sloan glanced over the file, then looked at Jason. "Mr. Allen, I understand you wish to change your plea today," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Jason nodded, eyes glued to the table. The judge asked him to read the statement his attorney had helped him write. My brother unfolded a piece of paper with trembling hands, and for the first time in my life, I heard him string together a sentence that didn't end with an excuse. "I, Jason Allen, admit that I entered my sister's condo without her permission." He read, voice cracking slightly. "I changed the locks and refused to leave even after she told me to. I assumed she would let it go because she always has in the past. What I did was wrong, and I understand it caused her financial and emotional harm." Hearing him say always has stung more than I expected because it was proof he knew the pattern existed and had counted on it. Judge Sloan accepted the guilty plea, making a note on the record, then moved to sentencing, looking briefly in my direction as he summarized the damage estimates and the fact that I had been effectively displaced. Given that Jason had no prior felony record, the sentence was measured but real: 12 months of probation, 100 hours of community service, mandatory counseling, and restitution for the almost $15,000 in damage and costs connected to the lock and emergency lodging. The judge also warned him that any violation could trigger jail time and that having a criminal trespass conviction on his record could affect future housing and employment. My parents both gasped softly when they heard the word conviction, like they'd assumed this would end with a lecture and nothing else. They didn't look back at me. When the hearing ended, they folded around Jason immediately, my mom hugging him hard, my dad saying something I couldn't hear. As they moved toward the exit, I stayed seated. Jason walked past me with his head down, shoulders hunched, as if he might say something, but my mom tightened her grip on his arm and steered him forward. I caught a snippet of her whispering, "Don't let her make you feel worse," like I was the threat, not the person whose home had been taken over. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself or to chase their approval. Instead, there was a strange calm in my chest, heavy but steady, like something had finally clicked into place. I walked out of the courthouse alone, stepped into the cold air, and realized that I didn't owe them any more explanations. The consequences rippled out in ways I didn't control. Jason struggled to find work. More than one background check flagged his conviction, and the dealership he tried to crawl back to didn't want him. I heard through a cousin that he eventually ended up doing delivery gigs and odd jobs, paying down restitution in slow installments, not because he'd suddenly become responsible, but because the court tracked every payment. My parents complained loudly in the family group chat I'd long muted, blaming me for ruining his future. But they also had to face awkward questions from relatives who couldn't understand why they'd encouraged him to hijack my condo in the first place. For once, their version of events wasn't the only one people heard. Meanwhile, I quietly rebuilt my life further away from their orbit. I refinanced the condo, and once everything was repaired, rented it out to a reliable tenant using the income to move into a different apartment on the west side of Columbus that no one in my family had ever seen. I changed my phone number, updated my email, and gave my new contact information only to people who had proven they respected me. Every Thursday evening, I walked into a small community center room where a group called Boundaries and Healing met. The facilitator, Naomi Ellis, had a gentle way of keeping us honest without letting us drown in our own shame. The first time I shared the story, my voice shook, but no one told me I was selfish. They just nodded because they recognized the shape of what I described. Over time, the noise from my parents and the extended family faded. They stopped trying to call because they no longer had a number that rang through, and any messages that slipped through social media went unanswered until I finally blocked them all. My days settled into a rhythm that felt almost strange at first: mornings with coffee and quiet instead of crisis texts, work that stayed about work, evenings where my space stayed exactly as I left it. I used part of the rental income and part of my salary to build an emergency fund in a separate bank I never told anyone about. For the first time, my resources existed for me and the future I wanted, not as a reservoir for someone else's emergencies. About a year after the hearing, a plain envelope showed up in my mailbox at the new apartment, addressed in familiar handwriting that made my chest tighten before I even opened it. It was from Jason. Inside was a single page, no dramatic opener, no lecture about family, just a short letter. He wrote that counseling, which had started as part of his probation, had forced him to look at the way he'd leaned on everyone, especially me, without ever considering the cost. He didn't ask me to forgive him or have dinner or pretend none of it happened. He just said he understood now that I had every right to call the police, that he was trying to be different, and that he hoped I was living a life where no one expected me to sacrifice everything for them. I folded the letter, slipped it into a drawer with my court papers, and felt no rush to answer. Recognizing the harm was the bare minimum, not a ticket back into my life. My parents never wrote. If they felt any regret, it never reached me, and I decided I could live with that. The truth was, I finally believed that their behavior said more about them than it did about my worth. I didn't need them to admit they'd been wrong for the story to move forward. I just needed to stop letting their choices dictate my future. So I kept my boundaries exactly where I'd set them. No calls, no visits, no holidays, no quick favors. They had made their decisions, and I had finally made mine. Now, when I lock the door to my current place, the key is just a piece of metal. But it feels like a promise I made to myself that what belongs to me, my home, my time, my money, my peace, won't be handed away because someone else is louder or more fragile. I know exactly where Jason and my parents are in the city, but I don't visit, and I don't plan to. I'm not angry every day. I'm just done. If you're listening to this and you've been told that standing up for yourself is betraying the family, I want you to hear me. Clearly, protecting yourself is not cruelty, and you don't owe anyone your life just because you share a last name. Thank you for watching my story. Tell me in the comments what you would do in my place and whether you'd have called the police on your own brother.